This episode discusses topics related to sexual violence. For more information, please check the show notes and always take care of yourself while listening.
Hey y'all, welcome back to Lux Supporting Survivors. I'm your host, EG, and whether you're here for the first time or you're a returning listener, I am so glad that you have joined us today. Some updates. I know that I told you guys that we will be uploading our second September podcast to YouTube, and we will. There just unfortunately will not be a video attached because the thing is, I really overestimated my computer and technical abilities. And so, because of that, John is out right now, and I cannot figure out how to do it by myself. So with that, will be on YouTube, which is super exciting, but the whole video aspect of it is like for sure a work in progress, and frankly will just not be happening effectively in September. But it is a goal, and it will happen, and I need to make it happen. So with that, other updates. It is September 13th while I'm recording this, which is super great and super fun, except I leave for a cruise with one of my best friends tomorrow in less than 24 hours, and I indeed have not packed. But when this comes out, you guys will be listening, and I will be on my way to Canada, so that's super fun. I'm really excited to go. I have really no other thoughts about it. I've always wanted to go to Canada. It's been a dream of mine for a really, really long time, so I am personally thrilled. And it's not going to be too cold, which is very important to me because I do not handle cold weather very well at all. So those are the updates, and updates they are. Jumping into today, kind of a big episode again. When is it not? But in today's episode, we're going to be talking about something very important, and that is triggers in intimacy. A lot of survivors find themselves facing unexpected emotional responses during intimate moments, and these triggers are normal, and it's not something that's normalized. So I think it's really important to discuss, and we're going to really talk about why that happens, what those triggers are, and how to manage them. And it's just, I cannot stress this enough. It is so important to talk about because anyone who's been through an event like this or anything traumatic, you know that there are certain things that give you triggers. And so when we're taking an event like sexual assault, of course there are going to be triggers in intimacy and other relationships. And it's not something that I've heard a lot of people talk about outside of a like therapist with the person situation. You know what I mean? So we're talking about it today. An important thing to mention before we like super hop in is that sexual violence does not just affect our sense of safety. It also really can impact how we relate to ourselves and our bodies and those that we love. Because when trauma enters the bedroom, it can be confusing and it can be overwhelming, and it's not just for the survivor. It can be that way for their partners too. And so today I kind of want to break down some of those experiences and then help you all be able to navigate them as well as you can, right? And I do want to say this is not necessarily a tricky episode, but this is a conversation that can be uncomfortable. Nobody wants to talk about sex. Like, it's very taboo, and I totally understand. But we just got to kind of take that out, be on the same wavelength here, and hop in. Because that's just what we have to do sometimes. Firstly, I want to talk about kind of understanding what triggers are and how they manifest, right? So triggers are emotional or physical responses to stimuli, and that can be sound, touch, environment, all those things that remind the survivor of their trauma. And so these stimuli will activate the body's fight, flight, or freeze response. And I think there's another one, like fawn, but I don't know what that means. Even though the current situation might not be dangerous. So for an example, say your partner gives you touches you on the arm, and that can be completely safe to them, an act of love, but it could also bring back memories of violence, past violence for a survivor. And so kind of the mismatch between the present and the past can be confusing, but it's a very normal response after trauma. something we've talked about, and I'm going to shout out my man, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. His book, The Body Keeps the Score, explains how trauma impacts the brain. We have talked about this. We have talked about him. We've talked about his book, all that stuff. And we're just going to keep mentioning it because it is a phenomenal book. Great read. Highly recommend. Throw it on your Goodreads. So in terms of trauma impacting the brain, when someone experiences trauma, the brain's amygdala becomes hypervigilant, and so it's constantly scanning for threats. And then there's the hippocampus, which processes memory, but that might struggle to properly distinguish the past events from the present events. So that's why you feel like you're back in that environment, back in that scenario, even though logically you're safe. So because of that, the body holds on to trauma well, which is so great. And that's why certain physical sensations can lead to emotional responses. And so going back to that book, The Body Keeps the Score, it really talks about this phenomenon, saying that essentially trauma is not just a memory, but it's an experience that's stored in the body. So that's so great to hear, right? But what is important to understand is that these reactions are kind of like your body's way of protecting you, even though it feels distressing. And so by understanding, that's kind of the first step, knowing kind of what's going on in your body, knowing that the trauma responses are involuntary, that can kind of help maybe reduce the shame or the frustration that you feel when you're having these trauma responses. So in terms of, I guess, common triggers for survivors, and I say common with a grain of salt because I think these are ones that people can experience, but it's not a complete list, and some people might not experience these at all, and it might be something like, it is different for everyone. Everyone's situation is unique, and so these are some that maybe are more popular, but if you have these or don't have these, it doesn't mitigate anything that happened to you, right? So just putting it out there. There's physical triggers, there's emotional triggers, there are situational triggers, verbal trigger. Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm saying trigger so many times that it stops coming word. You know what I mean? But so with the physical triggers, kind of just like those, like we just kind of talked about, is that there's certain physical sensations that can bring back memories of a trauma. So if you are unexpectedly touched from behind, or you feel a tight grip, that could cause fear and panic, even if your partner's intentions are loving. We also go back to the touching your arm example. And then there's also colognes, or like a partner's facial hair or something that could be reminders as well. And so physical intimacy is a situation where the body will often remember things that the mind kind of has suppressed. Like we said, involuntary responses, reactions. And so even simple touches could feel like an invasion when we're not prepared for them, right? In terms of emotional triggers, you get stuff like feelings of vulnerability during intimacy. And so that can stir up emotions you didn't expect. And so, because when we're intimate, we let our guard down, and then again, trauma can resurface because your mind suppresses it, your body doesn't, right? And so that sensation of being vulnerable or exposed, even if it's with someone we love and we care about, might cause anxiety and shame or emotional shutdowns. And so this sometimes, I feel like this happens a lot, whether, oh boy, we don't even need to get into it because that will be an entirely different conversations, but sometimes survivors feel the needs to perform or like go through the act even when they're not really emotionally ready, and that can lead to dissociation where your body is there but your mind is kind of like checked out, like not paying attention at all. And that's not even survivors. I feel like that can happen to a lot of people in general, but it is something that we might see kind of more with survivors. And then we also have situational triggers. And so that's just like the setting where the intimacy happens. And that can be triggering. Maybe it's dim lighting or closed doors or certain positions. And whatever that is, that can remind you of the trauma. And then honestly, like even time of day can matter. A lot of survivors feel trigger at night. And I say a lot as in like kind of common experience. Many survivors feel triggered at night, particularly if that's when their assault occurred. And so these can feel like quote unquote out of nowhere, but it is important to know that they're rooted in those real experiences. And then we have our verbal triggers. And these are specific words, phrases, or tone of voice that can evoke trauma. Phrases that sound controlling or demeaning, even if it was meant playfully, like as a joke, and that could take you back to a moment where your autonomy was violated. And it's also possible for people to feel triggered by a partner's expression of anger or frustration, even if it's unrelated to intimacy. And that can feel threatening, triggering kind of a defensive response, right? So when it comes to trying to like recognize your own triggers, that's really, really important, because identifying those triggers, one, it's personal, it's a personal journey, and it's just helpful in the healing process. And so when you identify those triggers, they might not be immediately obvious, right? So one thing that's really helpful is journaling. Journaling can be a really powerful tool. So like after an intimate moment, reflect how you felt. And I'm not saying like do the deed, hop up, start writing in a journal. But just think about it. Like, if there were moments where you felt uncomfortable or distant or dissociating, think about that and like what might have caused that, or if you notice like a shift in your body language. And so therapy is also a really good space to explore those triggers, and a trauma-informed therapist can kind of help you guide through identifying patterns in your reactions, especially those that seem kind of unclear, because there's unconscious associations we aren't maybe directly aware of. And then once you've identified your triggers, having an open dialogue with your partner is really important, because it can be uncomfortable, but discussing your needs and your boundaries kind of helps create a safer space for you. And that doesn't need to happen, right when you're about to go to bed. This can happen really at any time. And so some people, they'll do like a system, kind of like a safe word. Green, yellow, and red. So green is everything's like safe and comfortable. Yellow means you're feeling uncertain or cautious. And red means like stop immediately. And so having that system, having safe words, safe phrases, that can kind of give you a sense of control. And it's something you should communicate with your partner about. And you should be communicating with them regardless and everything, but also important to communicate about this. So in terms of managing these triggers, there's different techniques. So grounding techniques are really great. One effective method is breath work. So there's box breathing, the like inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. And so like if you feel yourself start to panic or dissociate, you can take slow and deep breaths, and that can kind of help calm the nervous system. There's also sensory grounding, which is when you focus on things you can see, hear, touch, smell, and taste, and that kind of reconnects you to the moment. And so you can also like hold on to something physical that has some kind of importance to you, like a pillow or a blanket, to also help remind yourself where you are and get back into a safe space in your head. In terms of safety, that's also important. Communication is key, like we talked about, but having a feeling of safety is incredibly important. So making sure to check in with each other, like, how are you feeling? Is there anything you're worried about? Are you okay? Is this okay? Things like that. And then, of course, safe words, like we just talked about. And it also doesn't have to be, like, green, like, yellow, red. Like, it can be, like, pineapple or, like, jackfruit. I'm kind of hungry if you can't tell. But it can be any word, really. It's just something you need to talk about beforehand. And then also having non-sexual forms of intimacy can also help build trust and connection. So that's like emotional closeness, cuddling, holding hands. That can be a good way to reconnect before engaging in more physical intimacy if you don't think you're ready for that, or you need a break because you got triggered last time, something like that. You know what I mean? Also, self-compassion. Give yourself grace. Healing from trauma is not linear. There are some days that you might feel completely fine, and there might be other days where you feel triggered completely out of nowhere, and that's okay. Being gentle with yourself and reminding yourself that you can take breaks or you can say no is completely valid. There's also other types of therapy, like somatic therapy, where if the triggers continue to impact it and it's just not, you're doing everything you can, somatic therapy could be a good option. It focuses on releasing trauma that's stored in the body, and so it's like sometimes used for people who feel like talk therapy isn't enough. And you can also go to trauma-informed couples therapy, couples counseling, And that can help partners understand how to navigate those together and improve communication and build a safer emotional environment. So in terms of how partners can help, it's really important, all partners out there, it's important to listen without judgment or defensiveness, and remember that your partner's triggers aren't a reflection of you or your relationship, and so you need to just be patient. Healing from trauma does not have a timeline. It's not linear, like we said, and so your partner might need time and space or reassurance. And also, by educating yourself about the trauma, it kind of will help you understand what your partner is going through, and it can make, in turn, conversations easier and more empathetic. So just be there for them. As John likes to say, anticipate their needs all the time. There's a really funny story. I know I mentioned it on some podcast episode where John, he might have even said it on the podcast, I don't even remember, but I was like, oh, like, you're such a good boyfriend, and he was like, I just anticipate your needs, and I don't know, it was really funny. I'm not explaining it well, so don't laugh, it's fine. But also joint healing strategies, back into what we're actually talking about. Mindfulness is really good, yoga is really helpful, and that just those activities that promote calmness and like maybe strengthen the connection between you two. And like, it doesn't always have to be physical intimacy. There's so many ways to build intimacy outside of sex, and so strengthening those or working on those can help with other physical types of intimacy. And kind of on that same topic, exploring other ways to bond, like new activities or talking about your feelings without expectations. It can create a sense of emotional safety, and that's really important because the more emotional safety you have, physical safety kind of goes hand in hand with that. So this was kind of a short episode. We gave you a real long guest episode a couple days ago. You should go listen to that because great episode, super long, but conversation was just flowing. It was awesome. So kind of a shorter one for September, but there's lots of content for you to listen to. So in conclusion, we've talked about kind of what triggers are, the different types of triggers you can experience, how to recognize them, how to manage them, and then kind of how partners can support that healing process. And intimacy genuinely can be a beautiful part of healing, but it's okay if it feels complicated right now. Just remember to be patient with yourself. Remember that healing is not about perfection, and it's about progress, one step at a time. And if you're struggling with intimacy and triggers, try and reach out for support, whether it's a support group, a therapist, resources like RAINN or Lux Resources. Healing is possible, and you always deserve to feel safe in your own body and your relationships. As always, I do have some media recommendations for you. Of course, the first, forever and always, read The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. We talk about him all the time. Great guy, great book. Read the book. That's all I'm going to say. There is a TED Talk that is applicable but not necessarily super on the subject, and it's called The Power of Vulnerability by Brené Brown. I keep seeing Brené's name everywhere, and so I looked into it and I saw this TED Talk, and I think it's really important, and it really was kind of the fuel for this episode in my mind. And then there's a book. I haven't read it, but I've heard great things. It's definitely on my to-read list. It's called Healing Sex, A Mind-Body Approach to Healing Sexual Trauma by Stacey, I want to say Hines. I've heard it's a great book. I think it's very applicable to this topic, and I think it's definitely worth the read, and I plan on reading it very soon. And of course, make sure you follow Lux on Instagram and TikTok at Lux Resources. And if you have content ideas or you want to share your own story or thoughts, email us at info@luxresources.org. If you are a survivor listening to this, know that your voice matters and that there are people out there fighting for a change, myself included. So, until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and let's keep pushing for a better future.